I've had a little bit of problems with sinus, and once you know, this morning it is acting up, and I find that I have to cough. You better turn the speaker down a little bit so when I'm coughing, I'm not coughing in everybody's ear. Bow with me for prayer. Lord, may the words of our mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable unto you, Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. It's kind of funny the way God works sometimes. I don't know if you give that any thought. I guess God has a sense of humor. He gave us a sense of humor. And we were created in his likeness. I'm going to speak from Job this morning. I chose to follow along with the weekly reading. In Job 20 and on, I believe, were the passage that was chosen for this past week. I was really looking forward to it and really enjoying my time of study to prepare for the sermon. And it got me to thinking that everybody should have to come up here and do a sermon sometime. And to go through that process of prayer, asking for discernment, asking for direction, and going through that process, because that's so important for me to also learn and to hear God's voice for something that I'm going to share. And I always think that it's helpful, sometimes anyway, that the things I share, I know a little something about, that I have a little bit of experience in, but unfortunately, I don't have that kind of experience for everything in the Bible, so I can't do that. But this morning, I do have a little bit of experience, and I found that as I studied, I connected a lot with both Job and Job's friend. And I'm going to use part of my story along with the sermon this morning. Now, in saying that, I want you to think about your struggle, your suffering. I can say, probably pretty safe, that most of us have suffered or are suffering in some way. That has happened in our life with issues, with things that have come about that we've prayed, and sometimes it just seems like God wasn't there. He just wasn't hearing, and there just wasn't an answer. And so we keep praying, hoping that God will step in, come down, and enter into our experience and give us direction about that. That's how I see God working, is that God is that busy working. I don't always understand his plan, but in the midst of my experience, I believe that God comes forward and guides and directs me and gives me understanding. And that's what I'd like for you to think about as I talk about this story in my experience. How has God, or maybe you feel like he hasn't, come to be very present and teach you in these moments of struggle? Because sometimes that can be difficult to see. It's not always so easy to see God at work, and I'll have a story along the way of an event, a story, a struggle of my own where it just doesn't seem so easy to see where God has been at work, even though I've been in, I wouldn't quite say constant prayer, but prayer quite often. The interesting part about this, I was telling my wife, I said, God has a sense of humor. Because, as I read this story, I struggled deeply with it. I actually became kind of emotional and energy charged and kind of thinking, well, I know what Job's talking about. I know I think what he's feeling. And so here I am struggling during my week, and I think that I probably worked at this sermon more than any time I've ever have, and I pastored for 7 years. I can't say it's going to be any better. But I struggled with it that whole time. And here I am today to preach about a man who struggled in his life and wondered where God was at and wondered why things happened to him the way they did. And so we're looking at the life of Job in his suffering. You know, it's kind of interesting, depending maybe on, well, not always, but depending upon your age, for example, you look at suffering in different ways. And then yet, on the other hand, there's a part of me that says, we talk about children and about their behavior and their attitudes and the things that they say. And then I stop and think, man, I'm 67 years old and I'm still speaking like a child. I've got a child right now. She doesn't have any money. She doesn't live at home. She lives up north in Northern Virginia. And she's been calling my wife, and she says, I got no money, but I want some snacks. I got to have snacks. Somebody else has got money, and they're buying snacks. And so this is her big struggle right at the moment. And my wife says, well, I'm sorry, but you've spent the allotted amount of money that you have, and there won't be any go out and buying snacks. Well, it ain't fair. I want money to buy some snacks. I got to thinking about that, and I thought about, well, you know, I'm not far from that sometimes. I don't have what I want. I struggle. And of course, I don't really suffer because I don't have snacks. But that ice cream at night is pretty special for me. And sometimes if you ask my wife or my other daughter, they'll know that I've asked them already, can you go out and get some ice cream tonight? I got to have my ice cream. Well, certainly people in our world have suffered in a variety of ways. I mean, every Thanksgiving, when we sit around the table and my sister and brother-in-law come over and join us, the question is asked, well, okay, what are you thankful for? There's two things that I always say. Well, last year we had to say, now you can't thank God for your family. You got to think of something else this year. But there's two things that I always say. I'm thankful that I've never known hunger. I'm thankful that I've never known homelessness. And yet there is a portion of the world population that knows both of those. I see people every week in my counseling office that talk about their dysfunctional family and the things that they see or saw or experienced. Sometimes unbelievable. I've had to ask myself while I'm sitting there and they're talking, is it possible that a family can interact the way your family acted? That one can experience the kinds of things that you've experienced. And the amazing thing about it is that there are some of those people who are the most grateful and kind Christian men and women who are able to say that in spite of the suffering that they endured by a parent. Unbelievable. I'm just blown away. I'm not sure, to be honest, if I could be filled with such grace. Well, all these things that we know that happens in our lives and in the lives of the world, it calls us to look to God and to understand. I say understand because as a person, that's my MO. If something's going on, the first thing I want to do is I want to figure it out. Why am I suffering? Why am I experiencing the things that I'm doing? And really kind of unlike Job. Job is trying to plead with his friends, and later he's pleading with God. I don't deserve this. I've been an upright man. And he's trying to make sense out of this suffering. And I find myself a lot like that too. And I suspect that each one of you do as well. That you ask the question, how do I understand this suffering, no matter what it might be? Now, growing up, I was personally influenced by something that I see in Jesus' day and my day as well. And that is a passage from Deuteronomy 11. I'm sorry. It says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, it comes if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. The curse comes if you disobey the commands of the Lord your God and turn from the way I commanded you by following other gods which you have not known." That seems to have settled in this child brain as I grew up into church. And it's very simple, kind of childlike. It says, if I'm doing well, I'm being blessed by God. But when I suffer, when things are going wrong, then the place I want to turn to is to ask the question, is there sin in my life? Is there something that I'm doing wrong? And I realize now that as an adult, that has kind of gone along with me throughout my life. I don't know if you found that to be true or not, but it's the belief that if I'm doing what is right, then I'm being blessed. Job certainly believes that same thing. He says, I'm an upright man. There isn't any sin. There's nothing that I can think of or point to, and yet you keep on telling me and accusing me that there's obviously sin. It's obvious that it exists in your life. One of my stories, a major part of my history for many years, is trying to find that place where I had sinned. I was a young guy. I was about 15, 16 years old when I had my first major depression. So if you know anything about depression, it colors your view about life, about yourself, how you think. And unfortunately, it always produces negative thought processes. It's never good. I remember one Sunday evening, I was trying to figure out, because I was feeling so desperate. I was on the point of thinking, I'm sure, about suicide at that point. And I thought, tonight at church, when we had this evangelist, I'm going to listen closely. I'm going to wait for the Lord's conviction to speak to me and to tell me about what I'm doing wrong. I'm going to confess it and make it right. And then I'm going to experience the joy and the blessings that come from God. I sat there and I listened. I sat up in the balcony, and after the sermon, people filed out. But there was no message. There was no conviction about sin. I still felt as miserable as I had when I went. It was extremely difficult because I was so convinced by the idea that if I were living in such a way that God would bless me. Maybe the blessing is that through my life and through the struggle is I've managed to believe that God had purpose for my life, that he had blessed me by giving me a family, and that I had purpose in my life, and I needed to live out that purpose. Job in chapter 22, as him and his friends are talking, remember, Job lost everything. How do you explain that? Imagine losing everything that Job lost. And not only losing that, but he suffered from illness, from sores on his body. My, I can't imagine going through that kind of suffering. It wasn't one thing in his life, but everything in his life. And here comes along his friends. And they say, is it for your pity that he rebukes you? Of course, talking about God. And brings charges against you? Is not your wickedness great? Are not your sins endless? Submit to God and be at peace with him. There's that blessing that comes from submitting to God and being at peace. In this way, prosperity will come to you. Accept the instruction from his mouth and lay up his words in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be restored. If you remove wickedness far from your tent, then the Almighty will be your gold, your choicest silver for you. Surely then you will find delight in the Almighty and will lift up your face to God. Boy, wouldn't you love to have friends like Job? You're suffering, deep in suffering and pain from all the things that you've experienced, and now you've got 3 friends who come along and say, it's because you're sinning. It's about your life. You've turned away from God. You're proud. You need to get right. You need to repent. Then things are going to be okay. Then you're going to be better. Your joy is going to be restored. But that's not what happened. Job continued to suffering. And there's these places throughout Job where Job is giving a defense, but his friends keep trying to convince him that it is your sin. That's why. And Job keeps saying, no, it's not my sin. It's not because of something I did. Unfortunately, I can relate with Job in that sense too. My depression came along in the 1970s. And back then, which doesn't seem so long ago for me, there's still this sense that mental health, mental issues was somehow closely linked to sin. Matter of fact, I heard a man say one time, when I said something about having depression, he said, well, I grew up learning that depression was a result of sin. Boy, that didn't feel good. To have somebody tell me that that's why I was suffering from depression and that I was sinning. But not only did I hear that, I heard people who say, and it still burns just a little bit in my gut, it says, if you would just give yourself over to God a little more, if you would just have a little bit more faith, if you would have, or if you would count your blessings, things would turn around. In other words, you have to get right with God. You got to give yourself a little bit more to God. Then it's going to be okay. You know, we try to find things, and like I've already said, try to find things in which I can say, get God's blessing, and then I can feel better. And I think of that for all of you as well. What is it that you have to do to be better with God so you no longer suffer? Well, I'm afraid, I hate to tell you, but suffering is a part of life. Take a look at the life of Jesus. Can you think of anybody that suffered more than him? His own people were against him. Maybe even his own family said, oh, Jesus, you know, we're here to take you away. You're sounding a little crazy. If you remember that story, it doesn't say crazy, but they're there to take him away. Okay. But then not only does his family maybe reject him, but his very own people, the people that he came to save, rejects him. You're wrong. You're cursed. And of course, they take his life as a result. You know, one of the things that people want to do, they get in an argument because something that people have said about them, like Job's friend said to me, was that we want to defend ourselves. And Job's not any different. Job wants to begin or wants to have the chance to state his case, but he doesn't want to have it to present to his friends, but he wants to go to God himself and present his case. Ask the question, or to tell God that I am an upright man. I have followed your ways. Listen to these words from Job in 23, 1 through 7. Even today, my complaint, and this is interesting, is bitter. My hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with argument. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say. Would he oppose me with great power? No. He would not press charges against me. There, an upright man could present his case before him. He's a righteous judge. Now, I think that's the nature of who we are as well. Because, when I found out for the first time, and I went years in a state of depression, I went to college even. I even pastored for 3 years in that state without knowing what was going on and always fighting this constant battle, but never being able to give any true answers. Job himself became exhausted, and he complained in bitterness. It tells me, even about my own story, is that it had gone on for so long that there was kind of a bitterness that came along. God, why don't you heal me? Why don't you change me? Why can't I be happy? So instead of presenting my case into, hey, I'm doing what's right, well, and I guess in a way, that's the same thing. I'm presenting my case. I don't know that I'm doing anything. After all, Lord, I'm growing up in the church. I'm studying my Bible, etc., etc., and I'm still not better. Job says, I'm an upright man. I followed in your footsteps. And yet, I continue to feel this heavy load. Job wants to find God and to tell him about how unfair his life is, about his suffering, and about how his life should have turned out different. I wonder if this bitterness, this complaint that he has, turned to blame toward God. That he blamed God for his suffering, rather than seeing God as the solution and not understanding why he's suffering, but he began to blame God for his suffering. When I was when I realized that I was going to have to give in, see, part of this was all a secret. I didn't tell anybody about what was going on. But finally, we had moved to Elkhart, Indiana, and while we were there at the seminary, I finally had to let it come to light. I had to call a counselor that was on staff at the seminary, and I said, you have to give me one good reason not to kill myself tonight. The next day, she says, if you can hang on and do something that gets you through the night, she says, I'm going to take you to a place where you can find help. Okay, how many times have I heard that? That there will be help? But the next day, she took me to a place called, Prairie View? Oakland, thank you. It's a mental health facility at Goshen, Indiana. And there I spent 5 weeks in a day program, every day. The bus would, or the van, it said Oakland on the side of it. Everybody there knows what Oakland is. I would get on that, and I would go to the mental health facility. And family members would say, how's school going? Well, I'm not in school. I go to a mental health facility. I needed help. I have problems with depression. On one of those days that I was there, the psychiatric nurse did a role play. That's one of the things that can be helpful in the therapeutic process, is to take people through a role play to speak or to help them discover, a person discover some of the stuff that's going on. And I remember it just like yesterday. She played the part of God. Of course, I played my part. And she said one thing that came out. And she says, "Terry, I want you to know how much I care about you and how I love you," and so on and so forth. And I just burnt with anger. I'm suffering. I'm dying inside. I'm tired of my life, and you're there telling me about how much you love me? I was so angry. I can't remember all of what I said, but boy, did I ever feel the burn. I wonder if that's a little bit what happened with Job in his experience. It's no longer a matter of just presenting his case, but he says, my complaint is filled with bitterness. Why? Because I continue to be at this place, and nothing really changes for me. Well, something actually did change for me. I became a mental health counselor. I knew what it was like to have days where I couldn't get out of bed because I was so depressed. I knew what it was like to only think about how to kill myself. I knew what it was like not to be able to hold a job. I knew what it was like to suffer financially because I had a wife that had to take care of 4 kids rather than 3. At least that's how I felt. But I became a mental health professional because I understood how difficult it is. Maybe if there's anything I can say that I learned through my experience, not even really learned, but happened for me, is becoming that mental health professional, because I understood. I'd like to say and think that it taught me to be compassionate with other people. For Job, he continued on in his suffering until finally, in the end, everything was restored. He got back what he lost, but not only back what he lost, but more than what he lost. He again, you might say, was blessed in this way. Now, Job is wanting to state his case. I found this very interesting. And so it challenged me as I was thinking about my own experience. And I want you to think about how this challenge comes to you. And it is in Job 38, 1 through 7. And I'll get there in a minute. Had my hand right on it and didn't know it. Now the Lord speaks. He's registered his complaint. He stated his case. Here comes the Lord's response. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself, man. I will answer you, and you shall answer me." My, those are strong words. I haven't ever quite got that kind of a lecture from God in my case related to my mental health. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched out a measuring line across it? On what were the footings set? Or who laid the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Wow. what could Job say? How could he answer? He had no idea. He thought the earth was flat, but that didn't want to help anyway. He had no idea. He wasn't there. I oftentimes think and contemplate this kind of thing, and maybe it has to do with my nature, and I suppose nobody else does this, but I think about, well, where did I come from? Oh yeah, I know all the biological things, to what it means to be born, but I stop and I think, where was my beginning? How is it that I have this spirit inside? It's kind of like this searching to find answers, so to speak. So maybe that's kind of why I've gone through certain things, is because I want to know. You know, inquiring minds want to know. Some of you that are old enough know that line. Well, I'm one of those people. I want to know. Now, Job, he can't answer that. But it's like God saying, why are you questioning me? You can't tell me this. You don't have knowledge or understanding, which leads me to think then, how do I understand suffering in light of what God tells Job? What is he really saying to Job about his suffering? I mean, obviously, God is not unaware of what Job has been going through. So what is God trying to say? He's trying to say that you and I are finite individuals, that we're limited, that we can't see the bigger and overarching vision that he has in play. Doesn't really state in this case that he caused or made Job suffer, though I've always struggled with the first chapter of Job and this conversation that goes on between God and Satan. God allows things to happen. I'm not really sure why, but there must be some overall plan, arching plan somehow that maybe relates to me as an individual and relates to you as individuals of the things that you're going through. And maybe it has to do with our understanding and learning about God and our growth as spiritual beings. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there, but I'm thinking out loud as to what's going on here. We're people with limited knowledge. We can't see the whole picture. If I might say it, life still has mystery. This book doesn't tell us all. It can't contain God totally. It only gives us a glimpse of who he is and of his plan. I don't know if you think about that or not, but it's good enough to get us on track. It's good enough for us to learn that God wants to have a relationship with us and that he has a plan for our life. But there's still mystery that goes on. I can't explain why I suffered, why you suffer. It's interesting about what God reveals to me in this whole thing. Because sometimes it seems like God comes, I said, God comes down into the midst of our life, midst of our history, and he reveals certain things to us. But then on the other hand, there's things that we earnestly pray about, and it seems like I might as well talk to that wall. Don't strike me dead, God. One day in my youth, I was at this great big outside convention. You had to bring an RV or something to stay in. And I mean, they had the most popular Christian bands there. They had the most well-known speakers for youth and stuff. It was fabulous. Quite honestly, if they had that for youth, I think maybe I would go. It was so exciting. But I went, and it was the day I was supposed to leave to go home. Now, where I was at, this was happening in Orlando. I lived in Sarasota, and back then you didn't have the interstate. So it took 3 hours to drive back home to where I lived. And somehow, I reached in my pocket, and I couldn't find my keys. And I thought, oh my goodness, what the world am I going to do? My parents are 3 hours away. They got the other set of keys. I'm going to be stuck here waiting for them to come and bring the keys so I can come home? Well, I told some of the other guys that I was bunking with in their RV. And we tore that thing apart looking for those keys. And finally, after we couldn't find it there, I went out and I started walking the grounds, which is kind of in some ways a joke because we're talking acres of land to try to find these keys. And I'm out walking, and I'm beside myself, and I finally say, God, I need you to help me find these keys. And bam, just like that, it hit me right where those keys were at. I can't explain it, but before I even got back there, I knew they were going to be there. And I got back to that RV that 3 guys got together and went through, and right there in the open, on a seat, those keys laid. Man, talk about God coming down. On one hand, simple keys. Okay, my parents could have come up and brought their keys and we could have drove home. But God came down into that and showed me exactly where that was at. I can't explain why he did that, other than the fact that I asked. But maybe I'm one of those that ask without believing, I guess. I don't know. But it happened that way. But there's also a more serious prayer that I've had throughout my life since we've had children. I've never tried to make it a secret that Christina and CJ both have mental disabilities, and it was hard. It was hard in our family. I'd be embarrassed to tell you some of the things that went on and some of the ways I acted and all of that through that whole experience. But there was violence in our house. We had a son that would attack my daughter here and my wife and me. And even when he got older and got my size, there was violence in which I had to protect myself against. And here's the thing. All those years, and occasionally even now, even though they're gone, I've prayed to God to give me wisdom about that situation, to know how to make it better. Because the problem is that I'm left with a little bit of bitterness that we've had to live that way, that my life had to be that way. My daughter was hurt. My wife was hurt. She was pushed down a couple times. One time hit her head and her head was bleeding. And yet I prayed. And I waited for God's answer to come down. But just like Job, there's never been an answer that I could put my finger on. And this words to Job. It just seems like what answer is there in that place? Why didn't God say, Job, you're right. You're an upright person, righteous person. You shouldn't have had to experience this. So I'm coming, and I'm going to give you all healing. I'm going to give you healing. But he didn't get that. He got this, what I kind of feel like is a mysterious answer. Are you there? Who gave you wisdom and knowledge? It takes me back to this John 9 passage. Remember the story about the man that's born blind? What does Jesus and the disciples say? They're walking along one day and the disciples see the man born blind, or how it's put, whatever it's put, and he says, Rabbi, tell us, who sinned, him or his parents? You see, they've got that Deuteronomy passage well learned too. Blessings and curses. And here's an interesting part of that for me. He says, this man wasn't born blind due to sin. He said it is that, let me find it here. that this is so that God's power might be displayed in his life. I contemplated that for a little bit, and I thought, oh, is that fair to that blind man? I mean, that's kind of how us humans talk and think, right? Is that fair? That he'd have to be born blind and maybe live 20, 30 years blind for Jesus to finally come along and to heal him? I don't know. But there seems like there's kind of a cosmic, kind of overlapping thing that's involved here that maybe we can't understand. Maybe, again, it goes back to mystery. That sometimes there just isn't going to be an answer at this point. And that is hard to accept. Because a part of me always wants to say, but no, wait, I want to understand my suffering and why I have to suffer. I'm not satisfied with mystery, and yet I have no choice. I have to agree that some things will not be answered in this lifetime. Well, I was given the buzzer over here by my family. It says, sit down. So I'm going to sit down. I hope that this has challenged you and given you some ideas and thoughts about your own suffering.